CBS Tonight, 10/9 Central.
Welcome back to Point of View. Tonight we have Director of North Dakota Watchdog, Dustin Gawrylow. Dustin, I wanted to have you on because your group is backing an initiated measure effort to basically not so much reform the initiated measure process, but to control how the initiated measure process is reformed. Tell us more about that.
Well, good evening, Rob. Yeah, what we're trying to do is simply leave the status quo in place and make it so that if legislators want to make it more difficult for citizens to process and refer and initiate measures in North Dakota, that they simply have to use the same process that the average citizen has to use. And we simply want to take away their shortcut in being able to put a measure on the ballot to specifically change the initiated measure process in the Constitution. And it's only restricted to that issue alone.
Now, basically, what the initiated measure process is, for those who maybe don't know, it is the process by which citizens can put issues, questions on the ballot to be answered by a vote. We've had several of them over the last several years, and of course the citizens can also refer laws passed by the legislature. Now, Dustin, what prompted this this movement from you? What's your impetus for this effort?
Well, during the last session, we saw basically a dozen different bills that were designed to restrict the public's ability to initiate measures one way or the other. They ranged from a way of requiring signatures from half of the counties in the state to putting the deadline for submitting signatures at 120 days rather than 90 days, and restricting who can circulate measures. And then also the big one that the legislature really wanted to get that they weren't able to grant themselves, which was a power to veto the will of the people. And really this comes down to the Constitution of the state of North Dakota. Article 3 of the Constitution is titled Powers Reserved to the People. And the idea that the legislature can at will put measures on the ballot itself to restrict those powers that have been reserved to the people really doesn't jive with the intent of the Constitution and the intent of Article 3. And so basically what we want to do is protect the citizens' rights to do this. Legislators as citizens in North Dakota can still initiate their own changes. They just have to go through the work of collecting signatures rather than having a shortcut in the legislative session to put things on the ballot automatically.
Now, all of the things that you just mentioned in terms of the reforms that you mentioned that you don't like, none of those passed. Isn't that the democratic process working?
Well, no, one of them did. The measure that would place the deadline for submitting signatures will be on the June 2014 ballot, and that basically removes the deadline from 90 days to 120 days prior to the election, and that takes out the ability for citizens to use the state fair of the election year to get on the ballot of the election year. And it also takes out the ability to use the winter show to get on the primary ballot of the election year. And so between that and the other measure that is on the November 2014 ballot, which is a measure to restrict the ability to place an appropriation on the ballot that either directly spends money or would cause the legislature to spend money, those two things are on the ballot already. Our measure would simply say that in the future, any changes to the initiated measure process must originate within the initiated measure process itself.
Now, the initiated measure process is in the state constitution. As I understand it, if the legislature amends the state constitution, that has to be approved on the ballot anyway. What are you adding to the process?
That's correct. What we are adding is that strictly for issues related to the initiated measure process, that the legislature not be allowed to initiate those. They can do it as citizens of the state and collect signatures.
But hold on, Dustin. If what the legislature initiates has to go to the ballot anyway, then what purposes is your effort serving?
The purpose is to eliminate the ability for the legislature to make those power grabs without doing the work that every other citizen would have to do in order to make changes to our state constitution.
Okay, so basically you want to add the additional hurdle. If you're going to reform the initiated measure process, you have to get signatures to put it on the ballot. The legislature can't just put it on the ballot. Is that correct?
Correct. All we are doing is we want to leave the status quo in place and make it so that if the people themselves believe that there is something wrong with their powers that have been reserved to them, that the people be granted that power and not the legislature to override the people that way.
Let me ask you this question. The state constitution is often seen by people as being a broad statement of ideas, the structure of government and things like that. Is it appropriate to be putting appropriations in the state constitution? Because as I understand it, one of the reforms that the legislature did pass and that citizens are going to be voting on in the November 2014 election, I believe, is whether or not the legislature, is whether or not you can put an appropriation in the state constitution. Do appropriations belong in the state constitution, or should those be in statute?
I actually agree with the idea of eliminating appropriations from the Constitution. However, the problem is that, as House Majority Leader Al Carlson stated in the Fargo Forum article, he referred to a measure that had a revenue restriction. I'm not willing to sacrifice the people's ability to restrain and curtail the legislature's ability to spend money by trading that for a measure that, or a constitutional amendment that prohibits appropriation. So no, I don't think it is appropriate to use the ballot box to spend money, to spend the public's money, but at the same time I think the ballot box is the appropriate place to restrain the amount of money that the legislature has to spend itself.
Speaking of that article, you mentioned that quoted both yourself and House Majority Leader Al Carlson. You said that one of the initiated measure reform efforts that was put on the ballot was, quote, shady. Explain.
Well, I'm not sure that that quote was in context of the two that were placed in there. There's this idea that these measures are pure and not, tainted by what was tried during the session. But we all know that the measures that were placed on the ballot in 2014 were the best the legislature could get. What they really wanted was that measure that would have allowed the legislature to override the will of the people once the people had voted for a measure that would have placed a legislative committee into the process to simply overrule the people or give the floor of the House and Senate chambers the ability to override the will of the people once the vote of the public had been taken.
Just a couple of minutes left, Dustin. We have seen some problems with the initiated measure process. We saw fraud in the last election cycle involving 2 petitions and a number of football players from an area university. Do you think there's any reform that's needed for the initiated measure process at all?
Well, I think that those problems that come with paying circulators really come down to the fact that as long as the Secretary of State and the Attorney General are promoting the law and enforcing the law, the system has worked. We have not seen a situation where a measure got on the ballot and then after it was on the ballot and voted on, there were problems found. It's always before the fact. And so the system is working right now. There's really no need to restrict the system because there hasn't been a situation that has been cited that there would be any problems with the current way that things are done. It's just there's a tendency to want to grab more power by the legislature and by state officials, and that's what I believe this is really about.
Dustin, thank you so much for your time, and real quick, where do people go to find out more information about what you're doing?
They can go online at protectnd.com. All
right. Dustin Gawrylow from North Dakota Watchdog, appreciate the time. I'm Rob Port. Stay tuned to 630 Point of View. Coming up, join the conversation. We want to hear your point of view by text, email, or call and leave a voicemail. We want to hear from you. Coming up, we have our final view. Stay with us.